The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk in the time that I have, if I can, about water, climate change, renewable energy and the RMA. Mr. Chairman, I love that quote from Herman Daly, a World Bank economist, who says that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. And I think that's true over the longer term. And if we think about what are the major parts of the economic challenges that we have in New Zealand, as the last speaker said, you really can't go past water, and I would add climate change. Let's think about what's happened with water. Very sad history of the decline in water quality in New Zealand. It goes back to the Resource Management Act being passed, full delegated authority to regional councils to control the degradation of our rivers. They didn't. They failed in their duty, in part because I think they were surprised by the speed of the transition to more intensive farming practices that were caused by the increase in dairy prices following the Doha round of the GATT, actually. In response to that, the last Labor government, we started to do something about it, and then the whole thing got sideswiped by foreshore and seabed, where the Labor government made some mistakes. Some mistakes were made by the National Party racking things up, and by Honi Harawira racking things up at the other side. Anyway, that somewhat confrontational and terrible confrontation that we had over foreshore and seabed left Maori feeling very suspicious that everything that we did in respect of fresh water was somehow going to try and usurp their claimed interests in fresh water. And so it took some 2 years for government to separate water allocation from water quality, and by the time we did it, we put a national policy statement into a process under the RMA that didn't pop out until just after the 2008 election. Now, the effect of that national policy statement, which was drafted by the former Chief Planning Judge of New Zealand, Judge Shepherd, was to say that clean rivers ought to not to get dirty, dirty rivers ought to be cleaned up over a generation, and in order to stop clean rivers getting dirty, we actually needed to stop controls and intensification of land use, because it's no longer the councils and the factories that are causing most of the pollution of our rivers. It's actually non-point source discharges, the diffuse pollution caused by increasing numbers of cows mainly, but also sheep and deer on our farms. Now, what did the National Party do? They spiked it. They put in place an inferior instrument which to this day does not control the increasing intensification of land use in New Zealand, which is why in places like South Canterbury we have continuing decline in the quality of our rivers. Not just in the lowland, it was worse there first in the lowland rivers, but also in the mid-country. Mr. Speaker, until we go back to that form of national policy statement, we will not get to the Judge Shepherd form, we will not get our river quality under control. Mr. Speaker, I believe that most New Zealanders want their rivers to be clean enough to swim in. I believe that most New Zealanders think that the most important river to them is the one that's local to them, that they want to swim in. And they're the two messages that I parlay around this country, and the people respond in saying, we agree with the Labor Party that the standard should be swimmability, and it should be for our local rivers, with the simple proposition that if their local river is clean and my local river is clean, then all our local rivers will be clean. We can do that over a generation, but today we can actually stop our clean rivers getting dirtier if we have the form of national policy statement that was promoted by Judge Shepherd. The National Party under Nick Smith say you can't do that. You can't have a swimmability standard because when they're in flood, you can't swim in them. What nonsense. No one's suggesting that the standard is for rivers in flood. He says that there are some rivers occasionally have seagulls defecating in them or in their nests on the banks of the Ashburton River. There's another example I've heard used. Well, again, we're not trying to stop natural causes of challenges to water quality. We're actually saying it's the human induced ones that we need to control. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to climate change because the performance of this government on climate change shows a similar weakness to what they've done in respect of fresh water. Before doing so, I'll just say I'm a bit tired of Nick Smith standing up and claiming credit for the Taupo and Rotorua restorations, which were approved by the last Labor government and funded by us in our budgets. Actually, I have to say, I actually opposed both of those initiatives in Cabinet because I didn't think we should actually have to pay farmers to stop polluting. But anyway, I lost Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Packer.
Mr. Chairman, but I think my colleagues, including Ruth Dyson, were right, because it was actually a bit of money from central government that actually facilitated the processes that has led to improvements in Taupo and Rotorua. Climate change. Well, who's the government preferring the interests of in climate change? Again, it's farmers. They've got an economically irrational emissions trading scheme. They've allowed the price of their really only instrument to control the growth of instruments to collapse to close to zero after the second Kyoto Protocol period did not happen and the price of carbon dropped to zero. They didn't do anything to stop units coming in. Even worse than that, they excluded agriculture, which is where 50% of our emissions come. Now, what's the effect of that? Well, increases in agricultural emissions become a burden on the rest of the economy, and a burden on the environment, and you get the land use signal wrong as between increasingly intensive farming practices which produce emissions and forestry which reduces emissions. It is economically unsound what they've done in respect of the emissions trading scheme. The Labor Party says we should have different targets for carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, from the target for reduction of methane and nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture, which make up 50% of our emissions but are harder to reduce to zero. We say that you should have a 40% reduction target in respect of the CO2 emissions from transport and power energy production and the like, and factory emissions by 2030 below 1990 levels, and a different target in respect of methane and nitrous oxide, because you can't reduce them to zero in the same way, but you certainly shouldn't be increasing them, and you certainly should not be keeping them outside the ETS. Sure, the agricultural sector needs high levels of free emission rights, but you must preserve the marginal price signal that penalises that industry for increases in emission and rewards them for decreases, and that's how an ETS works. In respect of renewable energy, this is an illustration of how national policy statements work. The last Labor government promoted a national policy statement on renewable energy. Since then, our proportion of renewable energy has gone up from 56, renewable electricity has gone up from 57% to 80%. That was through a combination, including the national policy statement, including a price of carbon, various things to improve the grid investments that the government recognised, the Labor government recognised were necessary to get distant renewables to market and therefore give the generators the confidence to invest in new renewables. And it's worked. And Jerry Brownlee tried to abolish the target of 90% renewables by 2025, but luckily the Prime Minister saw fit to throw him out of that role, put Hekia Parata in that role instead, and actually Hekia Parata had the good sense to keep that target that the last Labor government established. The RMA. After all these years, we've still got the National Party blaming the RMA for New Zealand's underperformance economically. We've got per capita growth rates of close to zero after 8 years of the national government. After a couple of attempts to amend the RMN, they still blame that as the cause of the economic underperformance of this government. Luckily, because the Maori Party, Peter Dunn, the Greens, New Zealand First and Labor combined to vote 61 votes against changing Part 2 of the RMA, 32 of those 61 votes coming from the powerful Labor Party, I note, they did not get to ruin Part 2 of the Act. There are some other changes which we're working through under the capable chairmanship of Scott Simpson at the Local Government and Environment Select Committee. I'm enjoying that process. We've got to fix things. I'm suspicious of some of the collaborative processes, some of the stripping out of appeal rights for people whose interests are adversely affected, but there's also some good things like templates so long as they go to form, not content. Mr. Speaker, overall I think the government, the national government, has to be judged harshly for a decline in water quality and increasing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. They've done all right, continuing what we started with renewable energy, and there are RMA reforms this time round. I think we can probably make a decent job of them at Select Committee. I hope if we have cooperation from members, we can get to a decent outcome there. Mr. Speaker, final point, estuaries. Our wetlands and our highlands and our wetlands and our lowlands, our estuaries, are our rarest landscapes. So many of them have been converted to agriculture or polluted. They are the filters through which we trap silts and things and stop them going out to sea. At the moment, Mr. Speaker, we need an NPS on...
Eugenie Sage.